Caleb Morin wasn't the kind of man who noticed other people. Not anymore. Not since the fever took his wife and daughter 10 winters ago. He lived quietly, 3 miles outside Granite Hollow, in a stone cabin no one visited and no one was invited into after sundown. Once a week, he rode into town for supplies, flour, bullets, matches, fabric, and returned without saying much to anyone. He was the kind of man folks forgot about until snow needed shoveling or wolves came down from the ridge. They said he lived like a hollowed tree still standing, but emptied of all that once mattered. Then the footprints started appearing. They didn't go to the front door. They looped around the back of the cabin, where he stacked his firewood. At first, he thought nothing of it. Maybe an animal. But when 3 of his best chopped logs were gone the next morning, he paid closer attention. The next night, it happened again. Then again. Each time, the taker took only a few pieces, never all, never enough to make him angry. Just enough to get through a night. On the 4th day, Caleb placed an old rusted knife beside the woodpile, more out of curiosity than warning. The next morning, the logs were gone again, but so was the knife. In its place, laid carefully on a flat stone, was a small piece of fabric, folded once, embroidered with a single line of thread, "Thank you." He stared at it for a long time. He couldn't remember the last time someone thanked him. Maybe it had been his wife, before the fever took her voice. Or maybe the young doctor who signed the death certificates and walked away with his hands too clean. His heart didn't twist. It just sank, like an old coat pulled down by snowmelt. He didn't say anything, but the next morning, he split 5 fresh logs, good ones, thick and dry, and laid them in a bundle beside the stone. That evening, they were gone. The cloth was gone too. But that night, for the first time in years, Caleb heard the soft crunch of footsteps outside his cabin. Light. Careful. Moving past the porch. No knock. No voice. Just passing by and fading into the wind. A week later, Caleb decided he needed help cleaning the cabin. Not because it was filthy, but because the chimney was backing up with soot. The floors stuck to his boots, and the stack of dishes hadn't been touched by anyone but him in months. He tacked a small note to the blacksmith's door in town, looking for cleaning help. 1 silver coin. No questions. No one answered, until 3 days later, when someone knocked at his door just past noon. A woman stood there. No hat. Coat too thin. A wooden bucket in one hand and a rag slung over the other. She didn't speak, just looked at him, steady and unreadable. Caleb handed her a key. She walked in like it was routine. No questions, no hesitation. She cleaned the floors, scrubbed the windows, polished the stove, and never once said a word. When the sun fell low and the shadows stretched, she washed her hands at the basin and left. No payment demanded. No second glance. Caleb had left a silver coin on the table. She took it without comment and disappeared into the trees beyond the clearing. No wagon. No horse. No trail. The next week, she came back. Same day, same time, same silence. She worked with the same quiet efficiency, then vanished again. A week later, Caleb left a small cloth bundle beside the coins, some leftover biscuits, and a jar of honey. That time, she took only the coin. She left a folded piece of paper in return. "Please don't do that. I owe nothing. I intend to keep it that way." The handwriting was neat, crisp, no smudges. Caleb read it twice, then tucked it away in a drawer he hadn't opened in years. A month passed, and with each visit, he found himself listening for her footsteps. Not waiting, not exactly, but noticing. He didn't speak to her, didn't ask her name, but when she moved around the cabin, when she adjusted the curtains, when she rinsed the tin plates in the basin, he watched. Quietly, without meaning to. Her hair was always tied back. Her coat was patched in more places than it was whole. Her boots had cracked soles. She moved like someone who didn't expect to rest. On her 5th visit, he noticed the edge of an old scar across her wrist when she reached up to dust the shelf above the fireplace. On the 6th, He saw a small canvas pouch tucked beneath her coat. Stitched on the flap, in faded thread, was a name, Ruth Ainsley. He never asked if it was hers. Then one Thursday afternoon, when the snow fell light and steady, Ruth left the cabin as usual. But this time, Caleb followed. He didn't plan to. He just found himself standing on the porch long after she vanished behind the trees. The trail she took was narrow, twisted, barely enough for one foot in front of the other. No wagon would fit. He left his horse behind halfway through and walked the rest. At the end of the trail, hidden beneath a bend in the ridge, was a half-buried shelter. Old mining timber, patched with tarp and frozen canvas. Smoke rose from a crooked pipe like a last breath. Inside, through a tear in the curtain, Caleb saw 5 children. The oldest couldn't have been more than 11. The youngest toddled barefoot across packed dirt. Ruth stirred a pot over a weak fire. When one of the little ones tripped and cried out, she scooped him up, held him close, kissed his forehead, whispered something too soft to hear. The children didn't cry. They moved like clockwork. One fetched water. Another sorted firewood. One folded a torn quilt with hands too small for such precision. Caleb stood there, unmoving, watching, remembering. Then he turned and walked back the way he came. The next morning, a sack of flour hung on the doorframe of her shelter. She didn't thank him. But she came back the following Thursday. She cleaned the cabin again. Silent, steady. Only this time, when she reached the door, she paused. Just for a moment. Looked back. And then was gone. Caleb didn't expect her to come again after that glance at the door. He thought maybe he had crossed some invisible line, one she wasn't ready to acknowledge. But the following Thursday, just past midday, she came. Same coat, same boots, same silence. Except this time, he found himself lingering in the room she cleaned, pretending to fix the hinges on a drawer that had never needed fixing. She didn't comment. She never did. But her movements seemed slower, more aware of his presence. Not cautious, just present. He tried not to stare, but it was hard not to notice the way she moved. It wasn't like someone doing chores. It was like someone reclaiming order from chaos. Every fold, every wipe, every sweep of the broom seemed intentional, as if she believed that cleaning his space was part of holding her own life together. That thought unsettled him. He didn't know why. After she left, he found the silver coin untouched on the table. Instead, in its place, sat a drawing, pencil on scrap paper, a rough outline of the cabin, with 6 small figures standing in front. 5 children and 1 taller woman. No names, no explanation. But he recognized the arch of the chimney, the lean of the porch beam. She had drawn his home. He kept that scrap of paper, slipped it inside an old book on the shelf, said nothing. The next week, she didn't come. Snow had fallen hard the night before, covering everything in white silence. Caleb waited until sundown. Still, no sign. Something in his chest twisted, not panic, not yet, but a cold awareness, the kind of quiet that doesn't settle, that whispers of something being wrong. By dawn the next morning, he was already on his horse. He didn't tell himself where he was going. He didn't need to. The path to the shelter was nearly invisible, buried beneath snow and broken branches. When he reached it, his breath caught. The roof had partially collapsed under the weight. Smoke no longer curled from the chimney. The front flap of the top hung limp and frozen. He dismounted quickly, pushing past the fabric. Inside, the children huddled together under thick quilts, eyes wide, faces pale. The fire was barely embers. But Ruth was gone. "Where's your mama?" Caleb asked softly. The eldest boy, Noah, stepped forward. 11, maybe. Already standing like a man who knew how to protect. "She went out," he said. "Said she'd be back before dark. She didn't come back." Caleb didn't wait. He saddled the horse again, left the children with his blanket and what little food he had in his pack. Then he rode through the hills, across the creek, along every side path and hollowed grove she could have taken. It was near dusk when he found her, curled beneath a fallen pine, half buried in snow. Her leg was twisted beneath her, and one arm bent at an impossible angle. She was conscious, barely. Her lips cracked, face white with cold. "I was coming back," she whispered when she saw him. Caleb said nothing. He just knelt, lifted her gently, and carried her to his horse. It wasn't the first time he had carried someone like that, but it was the first time in years his hands had trembled doing it. By the time they reached his cabin, the sun was gone, the air brittle. He had already fetched the children with a sled, bundling them in quilts, layering them against the cold. Now they sat silently around the fire, while Ruth lay in his bed, feverish and still. He didn't sleep that night. He kept watch, added logs to the fire before it dimmed, boiled water, stirred oats when the children stirred, even though no one asked for food. It had been 5 years since anyone else lived in that cabin, and now, somehow, 7 souls had filled it with warmth he hadn't known was missing. The next morning, Ruth hadn't stirred, but the children began to move, quietly, respectfully, as if afraid to take up too much space. Noah gathered more wood without being told. Elsie, the girl with dark braids and eyes like flint, portioned the remaining food into even bites and kept the younger ones close. Sam, a boy missing 2 front teeth and full of nervous energy, cleaned the hearth without being asked. Theo, small and soft-spoken, never let go of Ruth's blanket. And Rosie the baby still sucked her thumb, her other hand wrapped around the hem of her sister's skirt. They filled every corner of the house. The floors creaked more. The fire burned faster. And yet Caleb didn't feel invaded. He felt aware, awake in a way he hadn't been in a decade. He didn't ask questions, didn't ask where their father was. He didn't need to. He saw the answer in the way Ruth flinched in her sleep, in the way the children never raised their voices, in the fading bruises on Ruth's ribs when he changed the bandages. On the 4th day, Ruth finally sat up. Her voice, when it came, was clear and steady. "I told you not to follow me," she said. Caleb didn't look up from where he was kneeling beside the bed, checking the splint. "You told me a lot of things," without saying a word. She winced when he adjusted her arm. "You should have left us there." "I did," he said quietly. "Once." She didn't reply, just closed her eyes again, her breath catching with the pain. The fire cracked in the silence between them. Neither of them moved. Later that night, he found Noah sitting on the porch, wrapped in one of Caleb's old coats, staring out at the moonlit trees. Caleb sat beside him without speaking. "She doesn't sleep much," the boy said. Caleb nodded. "She gets up when she thinks we're all asleep, checks the bags, the coats, makes sure we can leave fast." "You ever ask her why?" Noah shook his head. "Didn't have to." They sat in silence after that, but something changed. Caleb didn't know what. Only that the next morning, when he woke early to stoke the fire, Elsie had already folded his shirt. Sam offered him a dented cup of tea. Rosie climbed into his lap without asking. They didn't say thank you, but he felt it. By the end of that week, Caleb found himself thinking less about how long they would stay and more about what they might need if they did. He repaired the broken sled behind the cabin, the one that had sat unused for years, and hitched it to his old mule. Then he rode into Granite Hollow and came back with 2 sacks of flour, a half-cured ham, a tin of dried apples, and new boots he wasn't sure would fit any of the children, but hoped might help someone. When the shopkeeper asked if he was preparing for company, Caleb just said, "Family's visiting," and left before more questions came. When he returned, Ruth was awake, sitting near the fire with Rosie asleep in her lap. Her hair was still damp from washing, combed and braided in a way that made her look 10 years younger and 20 years older at once. "You're not obligated," she said simply as he set the sacks down. Neither are you, he replied. That settled something between them. Not spoken. Not explained. Just a quiet understanding that lingered in the cabin air, warm and unshakable. Ruth stopped leaving after supper. The children began unpacking their few belongings into corners and shelves, an extra blanket here, a wooden spoon there, drawings pinned beside the window. Sam asked if he could sleep in the loft. Elsie started keeping track of meals. Noah helped Caleb fix the fence. Ruth began stitching the torn seams of Caleb's old shirts without being asked, her fingers moving with quiet focus. Caleb didn't tell himself this was permanent. He just started looking forward to small footsteps in the morning and the sight of little Rosie patting flour across the table like she knew what baking meant. But peace in a place like Granite Hollow never stays long. The first knock came 2 weeks later. Midday, sharp, purposeful. Caleb opened the door to find a woman older, tight-lipped. Her hair pulled so tight it seemed to stretch the anger across her brow. "You seen Ruth Ainsley?" she asked without introduction. Caleb didn't flinch, just stepped onto the porch. "Who's asking?" "Family," she lied. "Her husband's cousin." "That's so." She ran off, took things, took the children. "Jonas, he's beside himself. You know how men get." Caleb didn't answer, just let the silence build between them until it pressed against her like wind on canvas. "You hiding her?" she demanded. "Lady," Caleb said, his voice low and even, "if I wouldn't tell you." She left with a huff, but Caleb watched her all the way down the trail. That night, he rode the long route through the hills, checking for tracks, listening for hooves, the old surveyor in him remembering every bend of the land. He didn't tell Ruth about the visitor until the next day. She didn't panic, didn't cry, just pulled the children close and whispered something Caleb didn't understand in a language soft and ancient. The next morning, he built a hidden latch into the pantry floor. It wasn't much, just a crawl space dug years ago to store root vegetables. Now it had a lock, a blanket, a few jars of water, a lantern, just in case. Spring came slow, trying to shake the last of winter's grip. Ruth moved easier. Her arm still ached, but she used it. She planted a line of roots behind the cabin. The children laughed more. Rosie started calling Caleb Papa by accident. The first time it happened, Ruth froze. Caleb didn't correct the girl, just smiled and brushed her hair aside. But underneath it all, Caleb could feel it, that slow breath held too long. The tension of something not finished. He saw it in the way Ruth lingered at the window, in the way Noah checked the locks before bed, in the way she folded maps at night, traced trails with her fingers. She was planning something, maybe an escape, maybe a fallback. Then one night, Caleb heard her crying behind the door. Not loud, not broken, just quiet sobs, like a storm passing through a narrow canyon. He didn't enter, just sat by the hearth, the old hound scout curled at his feet, and waited out the night with her. In the morning, she was gone. Not far, just up the trail by the creek, kneeling beside the water, hands in her lap, hair braided tight. When he approached, she looked up but didn't move. "I thought about leaving," she said after a long pause. "Taking them. Disappearing." Caleb stayed silent, watching the water ripple. "But I think you'd follow." "I would," he said. She nodded. "And I'm tired of running." They sat like that for a while, the wind shifting around them. Ruth picked up a smooth stone, turned it in her palm, and dropped it into the stream. It disappeared beneath the current without a sound. "That man," she said. "Jonas Creed, the one who came looking." Caleb looked over. She didn't look angry, just steady. "He's my husband, by law, not by choice." She didn't wait for sympathy, just kept going. He wasn't always cruel, just proud, the kind of proud that curdles into rot. "I gave him obedience, then children, then silence. And when that wasn't enough, he gave me bruises. Caleb clenched his jaw. One night, I took the children. While he was gone, left a note. Said I hoped he'd never find us. You're not his anymore, Caleb said. She looked at him for a long time, then nodded. I'm not. When they returned to the cabin, Rosie ran into her arms. Elsie handed her a cup of tea without asking. Noah was teaching Sam how to tie knots. On the mantel, Rosie had left a new drawing 6 stick figures in front of a cabin. One held a loaf of bread. One held a rifle. Ruth smiled at it for a long time. Caleb didn't tell her what he'd seen the night before. A dark horse on the ridge. A figure watching from the trees. A crushed cigarette in the mud. He didn't tell her because he knew. Jonas hadn't gone. Not really. He was waiting. Caleb didn't sleep much after that night. He kept the lantern burning low, his boots beside the bed. His rifle leaned against the wall near the window. Every creak in the floor made his hand twitch. Scout, the old dog, began sleeping near the door again, ears perked even in sleep. Ruth said nothing, but she started checking the pantry latch twice before bed. She began carrying the rifle when she went to fetch water, her grip steady, eyes scanning the tree line without panic. Just preparation. Then one afternoon, Noah came back from the northern ridge with a stray dog following him. Thin, ribs sharp, eyes wild but not mean. Ruth didn't stop him from bringing it in. Caleb didn't either. They named it Ash. It stayed close to the children. Slept by the hearth. Never barked without reason. When it growled, they listened. Still, no sign of Jonas. Just the kind of silence that frays nerves. Not peace. Just the space before something breaks. Then came the fire. It happened fast. Caleb had gone to town that morning for nails and lamp oil. Ruth was home with Noah and Elsie, the younger kids napping. The smoke started behind the barn, near the old shed Caleb hadn't touched in years. Elsie saw it first. Screamed. Ruth got the kids into the cellar just before the flames caught the roof. By the time Caleb returned, it was almost out, but the ground was scorched, the air thick with soot, and the shed was nothing but black bones. Anyone see who did it? Caleb asked, dismounting. No, Ruth said, wiping ash from her face. But we don't need to. Inside the cabin, above Caleb's bed, something had been nailed to the wall. A strip of cloth Ruth's old apron singed at the edges, tied in a perfect bow. Below it, carved deep into the wood, were 3 words. She is mine. Caleb didn't speak, just stared at the words until the room felt smaller. Ruth stood behind him, her face unreadable. Do we leave? She asked, finally. No, he said. We make it clear we're not afraid. But fear wasn't the problem anymore. Anger was. The kind that lives low in the spine, sharp in the teeth. The kind that doesn't shout, it waits. Caleb wasn't a violent man. Not anymore. But he'd fought before, for land, for cattle, for his name. This was different. This time, he wasn't willing to lose. He began preparing, not for a fight, for a siege. Reinforced the cabin, repaired the shutters, dug a shallow trench behind the barn, moved the children's bedding closer to the hearth where the walls were thickest. Ruth taught Elsie how to reload bullets, slow and careful. Noah kept the small pistol under his pillow. Sam tied bells to the back door. Rosie stopped playing near the windows. No one told her to. She just knew. 3 days passed. Then 4. The air stayed heavy. Scout wouldn't leave the porch. Ash slept facing the door. Then a letter. It was nailed to a tree on the edge of the property. Folded parchment. Sealed in red wax like a wedding invitation. Inside, 4 lines. You made your choice. She made hers. The law is on my side. I'll come when I please. No signature. Just a faint thumbprint in dried blood. Caleb brought it back. Ruth read it once, then again. Her hands didn't shake. "He's bluffing," she said. "He won't bring lawmen," Caleb replied, "but he'll bring men who say they are." She folded the letter, threw it into the fire, and watched the flames consume it. That night, Caleb kept watch alone. The wind was too still. Scout paced by the door. Ruth sat beside the hearth, rifle in her lap, eyes focused. Caleb didn't argue, just poured coffee, gone bitter from too many reheats. "You think it's him?" she asked. "I think he's close," he said, "and I think he's waiting for us to get comfortable. He'll try something different next time. He won't get the chance." But both of them knew that wasn't true. Not entirely. 2 days later, a man arrived. Not Jonas. A stranger. Clean coat. Polite voice. Said he was from the county registrar's office. "I'm here regarding a custodial matter involving Ruth Ainsley and her children," he said, standing just past the porch steps. Caleb didn't move. "We're not interested in discussing anything." The man smiled, smooth and practiced. "Mom," he said, glancing at Ruth behind the screen door, "it might benefit you to hear what the law has to say." Ruth stepped outside, chin high. "What law?" "Your husband has filed for legal custody on grounds of abandonment and mental instability." She laughed, bitter, sharp. "Instability? He broke my arm. Do you have proof?" Caleb stepped forward. "You can leave now." The man tipped his hat. "I suggest you attend the hearing," he said as he mounted his horse. "Or it'll be decided without you." He left a sealed envelope on the porch. Ruth didn't open it. She burned it. But the damage was done. Not to their resolve, but to their sense of control. That night, Ruth sat at the table long after the children had gone to bed. Caleb sat across from her, hands clasped. "I don't have papers," she said. "No birth certificates. No marriage license. Nothing." "It's enough for me," he said. "It won't be for them." She stood, walked to the window, and stared into the trees. "We need someone who knew us, who'll speak truth if asked." "The Reverend?" Caleb asked. He knew Jonas. Knew me, too. He might not defend me, but he might not lie. Caleb hesitated. If Jonas is nearby, he already knows where we are. She was right. So 2 days later, they packed. Before dawn, quiet as breath, Ruth wore her cleanest dress. Elsie braided Rosie's hair. Noah rode in the back of the wagon with a rifle across his knees. Sam clutched the old doll Ruth had stitched for him from Caleb's flannel shirt. Caleb drove. Granite Hollow never looked smaller or meaner. The buildings leaned in, listening. They would come back, one way or another. The Reverend was older now, frailer than Ruth remembered. His back hunched a little, and his fingers trembled when he opened the door of the small house behind the church. But his eyes, pale and sharp as frost, hadn't changed. They saw too much and forgot very little. He didn't invite them in, just stepped aside, nodded once, and waited until they sat in the stiff chairs near the window. Ruth didn't ask how much he'd heard over the years. She already knew. "I need to ask a favor," she said, voice steady. The Reverend gave her a long look. "You need me to lie." "No," she said, "just not to cover for him." That made him sit back. The sun through the glass settled across the wrinkles in his brow like dust on old wood. "He's filed for custody," Ruth said. "He says I abandoned them. Says I'm unstable." "Are you?" She didn't blink. "I'm tired, not broken." He nodded. Just once. Then looked at Caleb. "You believe her?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "I do." The Reverend nodded again, slower this time. "I won't lie," he said. "But if the court asks me what I saw when they lived in town, I'll tell them." All of it. That was more than Ruth expected. It was enough. On the way back, they stopped for supplies. Ruth took the children to the feed store. Caleb crossed the road to the general shop for flour and coffee. He didn't see Jonas until it was too late. He stepped from between two buildings like a shadow that had waited years to stretch its limbs. Clean-shaven, coat sharp, hat tilted just so. "I'm glad you came," Jonas said, smiling like nothing had ever been broken. Caleb didn't answer. Jonas stepped closer. "They'll take my side. They always do, especially when the woman can't even spell her own name." Caleb didn't think. He just hit him. One punch. Hard. Years of silence behind it. Jonas staggered back, blood on his teeth. He didn't retaliate, just straightened his coat and smiled wider. "You'll see," he said. "The law's slow, but it never forgets." The ride home was quiet. Not tense, just heavy. That night, Ruth stood on the porch long after the stars came out, her shawl drawn tight around her, her hands gripping the railing like it might anchor her. Caleb joined her, slow and silent. "I'm not afraid of losing them," she said. "I'm afraid of what I'll become trying to keep them." "You won't become anything you're not already." She didn't speak, just leaned into him for a moment. Not long, not desperate, just enough. 3 days later, the summons arrived. Cream-colored vellum, wax seal like a wedding invitation. The lettering was precise. Cold, final, county court. 3 days ride south. Jonas Creed v. Ruth Ainsley. Custody hearing. Ruth read it by firelight. She didn't speak for a long time, just stared at it like she could will the ink to fade. "If they take them from me," she began. "They won't," Caleb said. But the fear lingered, thick as wood smoke. They left before dawn, leaving the children with supplies and instructions rehearsed over and over again. Elsie took charge of food. Noah guarded the rifle. Sam promised to read Rosie stories. Theo clutched the quilt Ruth had sewn from old shirts. Caleb promised to bring her back. Ruth didn't say goodbye. She just kissed each forehead like it might be the last. The ride south stretched longer than it should have. The road curved through thawing hills, past creeks swollen with snowmelt. Ruth didn't speak, but her hand never left Caleb's knee. The silence between them had weight, but not fear. Just resolve. The courthouse was a wide building with chipping paint and eyes in the windows. Men stood outside with folded arms and opinions they didn't voice. Inside, the air smelled of dust and stale pride. The judge looked bored before he even heard their names. Jonas was already seated, suit pressed, face smug, a man who believed he had already won. The hearing was short. Jonas spoke first. Calm, steady, lies rolling off his tongue like scripture. "She left," he said. "No warning, no note. Took my children, my home. I looked for years. I only want what's mine." He had witnesses. A cousin who'd never seen the children. A banker who claimed Ruth closed her account without notice. All of them said the same thing. Jonas was respectable. Ruth was unstable, unfit, too quiet to be trusted. Then the judge looked to Ruth. "Do you have anything to say?" She stood, not slowly, not hesitantly. "My children are not property," she said, "and I was never his." The room stilled. "I left with bruises. I left because my son asked me to. Because my daughter started to cry whenever he entered a room." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shake. "I don't have papers. I don't have money, but I have their trust, their love. I didn't abandon them. I saved them." Then she sat down. The judge said nothing, just stared at her with eyes too tired to be surprised. "We'll issue a decision within the week," he said, then dismissed them. Outside, the sun felt false, the sky too wide. The ride home began in silence. Not dread. Not yet. Just a waiting breath neither of them could exhale. Until they reached the ridge. Until they saw the smoke. The cabin stood. But on the porch, nailed to the beam, was Rosie's doll. Torn. Stained. Arms spread like a crucifix. Ruth leapt from the wagon before it stopped, yanked the doll down with shaking hands. Ran inside. Nothing broken. But nothing right. The cellar door open, the food untouched. Noah, Elsie, Sam, Theo, Rosie. Gone. No notes. No tracks. Just chalk on the table. 4 words. You lose. Caleb fell to his knees. Ruth didn't move. She just whispered one word, her voice small and full of steel. Where? Caleb closed his eyes, thought harder than he ever had. And then he remembered. South Ridge. Past the creek. A hunting cabin Jonas's cousin used to own. Remote. Lawless. He opened his eyes. Ruth was already on the horse. The wind on South Ridge cut sharper than usual that evening. It came down from the peaks, like it remembered something bitter, something long buried but not forgotten. Ruth urged her horse forward without waiting for Caleb. The sky above her bled orange, chasing the last of the light behind the hills, but she didn't slow. Her children were out there, somewhere between shadow and silence, and she wasn't going to lose them now. Caleb followed close behind. He didn't shout for her to stop, didn't tell her to think. He knew better. The road they rode was no longer just about law or lies. It was about blood and memory and fire that never truly went out. They reached the South Ridge just as the sun dipped and the world turned to bruised blue. The old hunting cabin squatted between the trees like a wound in the land. No lantern light, no smoke from the chimney, just stillness, the kind that made your stomach twist before your thoughts caught up. Ruth slid off her horse, boots barely making a sound in the dirt. Caleb joined her, rifle in hand. His eyes scanned the perimeter like a man counting ghosts. There, she whispered, pointing to the side window. A flicker. A shape. Small. Curled. Theo. Ruth moved before he could stop her. Around the back, low to the ground. Her palms pressed to the earth like she could absorb courage from it. The rear door was cracked. Inside, she heard it Rosie's muffled sob. The sound carved through her like a knife. Then, Jonas's voice. Low, crooning, like he was speaking to a dog that had bitten him, but he still meant to pet. You remember your daddy, don't you? Not like that man your mama runs with. He doesn't know how to take care of you. Doesn't know you like I do. Ruth's hand clenched around the knife at her belt. She'd meant to use it for supper. Now it would serve another purpose. Inside, Jonas sat with Rosie on his lap, arms coiled too tight around her. The other children were huddled in the corner, frozen, wide-eyed. Caleb was already slipping through the other door, rifle raised, silent as dusk. Jonas saw him a second too late. Let her go, Caleb said, voice like gravel soaked in rage. Jonas stood, still holding Rosie. The girl whimpered. You shoot me, Jonas hissed, and she falls with me. He was right. The knife in Ruth's hand trembled. Then Noah moved. A stone. Just a small one. From his pocket. It hit the oil lamp on the shelf. The flames sputtered. Glass cracked. Jonas turned. That second was enough. Ruth lunged. The knife found his forearm. He roared. Dropped Rosie. Caleb grabbed her and shoved her back toward Noah. The fight was ugly. Not choreographed. Not brave. Just teeth and fists and the weight of 1,000 yesterdays. Jonas was taller, meaner, But Ruth was desperate, and Caleb was furious, and together they were something that couldn't be reasoned with. In the end, it was Rosie who ended it. She'd found the poker by the hearth, and when Jonas raised his hand one final time, she swung it. The sound was dull, final. Jonas dropped like wet laundry, not dead, but finished. Ruth wrapped her arms around Rosie, who shook in silence. "It's over," she whispered. "You're safe." The others gathered close, clinging to each other like shipwreck survivors. Caleb didn't speak. He just stood there, chest heaving, blood on his shirt that wasn't his. They didn't wait for the law. They bound Jonas with rope and rode out under moonlight, leaving him locked in the cabin like a bad memory. They made it home by dawn. And still, the world kept turning. News traveled. The sheriff arrived a day later. He'd heard of the custody trial, heard whispers of a scuffle. When he saw the bruises on Ruth's wrists, the blood on Caleb's coat, and the way Rosie refused to let go of her mother's hand, he just nodded. "He won't be back," he said. "Not if he values his teeth." No charges were filed. Ruth spent the next week silent, not broken, just quiet. She cooked meals. She brushed hair. She sewed stitches into old shirts like she was mending something deeper. Then, one morning, she stood on the porch with Caleb. A new dawn. A clear sky. "I think I want to stay," she said. He didn't smile, just nodded. "I don't mean just for them," she added, eyes meeting his. "I mean for me." Caleb took her hand. Warm, rough, steady. "Then we build," he said. And so they did. They added to the cabin, room by room, board by board. Not fancy, not fast, but strong. And for the first time in a long while, Ruth began to laugh. Not because the world was kind, but because she had carved out a piece of it that couldn't be taken. One evening, months later, a wagon came up the ridge. A young woman. Alone. Dusty. Hollow-eyed. Ruth stepped off the porch and met her with open hands. "Looking for shelter?" she asked. The woman nodded. "Ran from a man who thinks I'm his." Ruth looked over her shoulder at the house, at the firelight in the windows, at the children playing in the dirt. Then back at her. "Well," she said, "you're not." And just like that, another story began. Autumn settled over Ridge Hollow like a quiet hymn. The wind turned cooler, threading through the branches with a gentler tone, and the light became golden longer, softer, like it too was tired of running. Ruth had taken to waking up early, long before the children stirred, just to sit on the front steps and watch the land stretch itself awake. Caleb would often join her, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with silence, and she never minded which. His presence, whether speaking or not, had become as steady as the earth beneath her feet. The young woman who had come to them weeks earlier, her name was Myra, had begun to smile again. At first, only when the children made her laugh. Then, when Ruth let her mend the linens. Then once more, when Caleb offered her the spare mule to ride. Ruth watched this return to life with a quiet protectiveness, as if guarding the flicker of something too precious to name. She knew the look of a woman who'd been taught to flinch. She also knew how long it took for the body to believe that it no longer had to. One afternoon, as the wind shook loose the first of the red leaves, Ruth took Caleb's hand while he was chopping wood and said, "Let's build another room." He looked up, sweat on his brow. "For Myra?" "For whoever comes next," she said. "This place, it's bigger than us now." He wiped his axe on his sleeve and nodded. "Then we'd best start cutting." So they did, together, each swing of the axe like a prayer for the broken, each plank nailed into place like a promise to the wandering. And soon, Ridge Hollow had more than a cabin. It had a sanctuary. The children flourished. Noah began whittling, carving animals from scrap wood. Rosie took up sketching images of horses and hills and the cabin under stars. Theo, ever quiet, learned how to fish and to listen to the world when it had nothing to say. Caleb taught them all, patient and unassuming. He never talked much about what he used to be, and Ruth never asked. What mattered was who he was now. One evening, as the fire crackled low and the sky turned from indigo to ink, Myra stood in the doorway with something folded in her hands. It was a letter, crumpled, worn at the edges. "I got this 2 months ago," she said, "before I came here." Ruth and Caleb exchanged a glance. "My brother," Myra continued. "He's been looking for me. Said he's sorry. Said he didn't know what the man was doing to me. He left home. He's up north now, working a rail camp near Smoke Valley." Caleb leaned forward. "Do you trust him?" Myra paused. "I used to. He was just a boy when I left." Ruth stood, walked over and took her hand. "You don't owe anyone your return, but you do owe yourself a choice." Myra folded the letter again. "I think I want to see him, just to know I'm not running anymore." Caleb nodded slowly. "Then we'll ride you part way. Safer that way." They made plans. Ruth packed her a satchel of dried meat, apples, a stitched scarf she'd finished just that week. Myra wept quietly as she hugged each child, kissed Ruth's cheek, and whispered, "For the kind of peace I didn't know I could find." As Myra rode off down the winding trail with the sun behind her and Caleb at her side, Ruth stood on the porch and watched until they were just dust in the wind. She didn't cry. She didn't worry. She just whispered a silent blessing to the sky and then went back inside, where warmth still lingered on the hearth. That night, Caleb returned, a little dusty, a little more tired, but with a new quiet in his step. He sat beside Ruth by the fire, the flames dancing between them like old friends. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "She's going to be all right," he said. "I know," Ruth whispered, "because she left knowing she was loved." The fire popped. "She reminded me," Ruth said, "what I used to be afraid of, and what I'm not anymore." Caleb turned his head slightly. "And what's that?" "That I'd never be home again." He didn't reply. He just pulled her closer. And for a while, neither of them said a word. The wind outside moved like a lullaby. The stars blinked, patient and eternal. And Ridge Hollow, built from scars, prayers, and second chances, stood tall beneath it all. When winter came, they would be ready. Not because they had firewood stacked or shelves filled, though they did, but because they had something better. A place built from the ground up with purpose, with tenderness, with grit. A place that knew what pain looked like and chose to welcome it anyway. And as Ruth drifted to sleep that night beside Caleb, her hand resting over his, she dreamed not of what she had lost, but of what she was still building. The first snowfall came earlier than usual that year. By mid-October, Ridge Hollow lay tucked beneath a white hush, like the whole world had taken a long, deep breath and decided to rest. Snow piled along the fence posts, blanketed the roof, softened the sharp lines of the world Ruth and Caleb had worked so hard to build. And yet, inside the cabin, it was warmth that reigned. Ruth had turned the front room into a small school corner, gathering the children around the table each morning with worn books, ink pots, and scraps of paper salvaged from Caleb's old shipping crates. Rosie was a quick learner, curious and wide-eyed. Theo, quiet as always, learned by listening, watching. Noah, the eldest, struggled most with the reading, but could tell you the name of every tree on their land and how to tell their bark apart in the dark. Ruth never rushed them. She taught by asking, not telling, just as life had taught her. Caleb kept busy chopping wood, reinforcing the barn, checking traps in the early dawn. He'd grown broader, if that was possible, muscles thick under his flannel beard fuller now, touched with frost in the mornings. But there was a softness to him, too, a gentleness that only surfaced when he spoke low to Theo about carving, or when he helped Rosie fix her crooked sketches. Ruth watched him, often silently, marveling that this man, once a name feared along the frontier, was now the reason her children laughed freely in the snow. But winter was not without teeth. One evening, as the wind howled harder than usual, and Caleb was still not back from checking the southern traps, Ruth paced the cabin, every log of firewood burning too quickly. The sky had gone slate gray by late afternoon, and the snow fell sideways, now driven, angry. She bundled up in her old coat, grabbed the lantern, and saddled their strongest horse. "You stay with Rosie," she told Noah. "Theo, bar the door behind me. I'll be back with him." They nodded, eyes wide but trusting. Caleb's steadiness had become theirs. She rode out, lantern swaying, each hoofstep vanishing beneath fresh snow within seconds. The trail south was narrow and near invisible now, but Ruth knew it like the lines on her palms. Half a mile in, she found the sled tipped over, a bag of snares torn open by some rushing gust. And beside it, a set of tracks, one foot dragging slightly. "Caleb," she whispered. She pressed on, heart pounding louder than the wind. Then, in the distance, slumped near the base of a tree, she saw him. His arm was clutched to his side, blood staining the snow a dark maroon. His face was pale, lips cracked. "There," he muttered when she reached him. "Didn't get me deep. Just dumb. Too close." Without a word, Ruth helped him up, looping his arm around her shoulder, lifting with all her strength. He was heavy, the kind of heavy built from labor and heartbreak, and a life lived long in silence. But she carried him. They made it back just past dusk. Ruth and Noah pulled him inside while Theo stoked the fire until the room glowed gold. She cleaned his wound, stitched it as Caleb winced but never cried out. Rosie held his hand. Noah kept the fire fed. And when it was done, Ruth sat beside him, brushing the damp hair from his brow. "You're not allowed to die in the snow," she whispered. "I wasn't planning to," he rasped. He slept for 2 days straight, and in that time, Ruth didn't leave the cabin. She read aloud to the children, cooked broth, and checked his bandages. When he finally woke, eyes clearing to find her beside him, he reached out and found her hand waiting there. "Thought I lost you," she said softly. "You'd have found me," he answered. And she would have. Weeks passed. Snow deepened. But within the cabin, life didn't pause. It shifted. Ruth began teaching the children to sew. Caleb slowly returned to his chores, taking shorter rounds, resting more often. The injury reminded them that life was still fragile out here. But it didn't scare them like it used to. Because now, there were hands that reached back when you called. A roof that held. A family that chose you not for your past, but for your presence. And then, one quiet morning, a knock came at the door. A figure stood there, bundled in wool and leather, face red from the wind. A young man, early 20s, nervous smile. "Mom," he said, voice shaking. "I was told there's a place here that don't turn folks away." Ruth looked him over. His eyes were hollow with hunger, but his stance was respectful. "What's your name?" she asked. "Daniel." She stepped aside. "Well then, Daniel, come in from the cold." Behind her, Caleb stood leaning against the wall, arms crossed, nodding once. The children peeked out from the loft stairs. Daniel removed his coat, stomping snow from his boots, and just like that, the cabin grew by one more soul. Ruth didn't smile. She didn't need to. The warmth of her welcome was already lighting the fire. Winter pressed on, relentless and bone-deep. Ridge Hollow was now blanketed in silence, a kind of stillness that only heavy snow and memory could conjure. Days were shorter. Nights stretched long, the kind that tested a soul's patience and a body's strength. But within the cabin, life beat steady like a heartbeat beneath layers of wool and wood smoke. Daniel had settled in without fuss. He was lanky, quiet, and eager to prove his worth. He chopped wood until his hands blistered, helped Caleb check the traps on days when the wind didn't threaten to rip their faces off, and stayed up late listening to Ruth's soft teachings about maps, words, and the quiet laws of kindness. He spoke little of where he came from, only that he'd worked cattle down near Lakota Bluff and had walked for days after being run off by a rancher who didn't like the look of him. Noah watched him with a quiet caution. Rosie adored him instantly. Theo said nothing, but one day left his favorite carved bird on Daniel's bedside stool. That meant more than words. Caleb was slower now, the wound in his ribs healing but stubborn. The pain had softened him in ways neither time nor love had done. It humbled him to need help. And it was Daniel who filled the spaces. Caleb couldn't lifting heavier loads, keeping watch when the frost threatened the chicken coop, sharpening the tools at dusk. But even with the rhythm of chores and survival, something in Ruth stirred restlessly. At night, while everyone else slept, she would sit by the fire and listen to the wind move through the trees like a voice half remembered. Her hands, always busy, now rested too long on her lap. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, sometimes drifted to the window as if expecting someone or something to appear from the dark ridge beyond the creek. Caleb noticed. One night, he joined her, limping slightly, and sat beside her without speaking. They stared into the fire. Minutes passed, quiet as breath. "You feel it too?" she asked. He nodded. "Change?" She looked at him. "It's like the ridge is watching us." "It's been watching since the day we arrived," he said, his voice slow, low. "But now it waits." "For what?" Caleb didn't answer right away. Then he whispered, "For you." The next day, a rider came. They saw him from the edge of the property, black horse, dark coat, posture too straight to be a trader. He didn't approach fast, just moved at a steady, inevitable pace. Caleb and Daniel stepped outside, rifles slung but not raised. Ruth followed, her breath catching. The rider pulled back his hood. The face beneath it was worn, marked by sun and bitterness. His eyes were ice blue. "Ruth," he said, not as a question. She froze. It had been 9 years since she heard that voice. She'd thought him long dead, or at least far gone. Her brother, Elias. "You're not welcome here," Caleb said, stepping forward. Elias didn't flinch. "I came for her, not for you." Daniel shifted, tense. The children watched from inside, wide-eyed. "I have nothing left to give you," Ruth said. Her voice didn't shake. Elias dismounted. "You had something once. You still do." He looked around, at the land, the cabin, the family not of blood but of bond. "You built all this," he said. "I did," she replied, "without your kind of help." "You always were the smart one," he said, almost wistful. "But I need smart now." Ruth narrowed her eyes. "No. You haven't heard what I came to ask." "I don't need to." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "They say the soldiers are pushing west again, through the hollow. I thought you'd want to know before you woke up to boots on your doorstep." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut air. "Go," Caleb said, stepping between them. Elias looked at him, at the children now gathered at the window, at Ruth, stronger than he remembered, older, wiser. "You're not the girl I left behind," he said. "Maybe you never were." He turned, mounted again, and with a final nod, rode off into the snow. Ruth didn't speak for hours. That night, after the children slept and Daniel dozed near the stove, she turned to Caleb. "I thought I'd buried that part of my life." "You didn't," he said softly. "You just stopped watering it." "I'm not afraid of him," she added. "I know, but I am afraid of what follows him." The next morning, she gathered the children, Daniel and Caleb, around the table. The map Caleb had drawn on buckskin was unrolled. She pointed to the pass near Ridge Hollow. "If soldiers come," she said, "they'll take what they want. Land, animals, people. They won't ask who built it. Noah asked, "What do we do?" She looked at each of them. We stay. We protect what's ours. But more than that, we prepare to welcome whoever has nowhere else to go. Rosie tilted her head. Even strangers? Ruth smiled faintly. Especially strangers. Outside, the snow began to melt, one flake at a time. Spring didn't arrive in Ridge Hollow so much as it crept timid and cautious, like an apology whispered after a long silence. The snow melted in streaks, not sheets, and the air grew heavy with the scent of thawed earth and pine sap. Streams that had frozen in place now sang again. Birds returned in ones and twos, timid at first, then louder, bolder, as if trying to remember what joy felt like. But in Ruth's cabin, change wasn't just in the season, it was in the weight of every breath, the choice behind every word. Since Elias had come, the days felt split into two kinds. The ones where the family worked hard and forgot the world beyond the ridge existed, and the ones where the shadow of boots and brass loomed just behind the trees. Caleb had started carving again. He said it steadied his hands and his heart. Ruth watched him some evenings as he shaped a piece of driftwood into a wolf's head, his thumb brushing dust from the muzzle, like a man recalling a face he once knew. Daniel had grown stronger, not just in body, but in presence. He wasn't just a boy they'd taken in anymore. He was one of them. He took to Noah like a brother and learned from Caleb like a son would, silent, deliberate, proud. He carried himself like someone who had stopped running. The children, too, had changed. Theo, no longer startled at sudden noises. Rosie asked deeper questions. And Noah had taken to sitting at the edge of the ridge some mornings, looking out over the land like a boy preparing to become a man. And Ruth had begun to write again. At first, just notes, plants that had survived winter, routes they might take if trouble ever came too close, names of those they'd help. Then, stories, pieces of her mother's voice, her own childhood, warnings, blessings, hopes wrapped in paragraphs. They weren't for anyone in particular, and yet they were for everyone. She tucked them between the pages of a worn journal Caleb had found in the old general store ruins and gifted her quietly. But no matter how well they adjusted to peace, the memory of Elias's visit was like a flint in dry grass, one spark away from fire. That spark came in the form of smoke. Not theirs. Not from the hearth, but from beyond the ridge. It was Daniel who saw it first. He was mending the chicken coop when he froze, his eyes locked on the faint curl of gray lifting against the pale blue sky. "Ruth," he called. "Someone's burning." By the time Caleb reached the lookout, the smoke had thickened too much for a campfire, too thin for a forest blaze. Ruth joined them, her eyes narrowing. "That's near the foothill trail," she said, "close to the old salt mines." Caleb set his jaw. "That's not natural." Daniel asked, "Should we go?" "No," Ruth answered. "We wait." But waiting was its own kind of wound. By dusk, they heard it hoofbeats. Not just one. Many. Distant, but undeniable. Caleb and Daniel moved fast, herding the children inside, locking the shutters, and standing guard. But it wasn't soldiers who came. It was people. A procession of them. Dirty, limping, terrified. Men, women, children, wrapped in blankets, clutching sacks, dragging their pain with them like ghosts chained to living bodies. Ruth stepped out before Caleb could stop her. One woman at the front dropped to her knees. "They're burning settlements," she cried. "Pushing west. Said we didn't have claim." Ruth knelt beside her, took her face gently in her hands. "You're safe here. We'll make room." There were 23 of them. That night, the cabin filled past bursting. Floor space became beds. Bread was rationed, broth stretched, and not one of Ruth's family questioned it. Daniel gave up his cot to an old man who couldn't stand. Rosie shared her scarf with a girl who hadn't spoken a word since arriving. Caleb kept the fire going through the night without rest. And Ruth, she didn't sleep. She moved from person to person, checking wounds, whispering names, feeding, warming, listening. At dawn, she stood on the porch beside Caleb. "Elias warned us," she said. "He didn't warn. He threatened," Caleb replied. "I don't care what his intent was," she said. "He was right about one thing." Caleb looked at her. "We're not just a family anymore. We're a refuge." He nodded. "Then we protect it." That day, they built more than fires. They built trust. A few of the newcomers knew how to hunt. One woman was a midwife. A man had once been a blacksmith. They offered their skills without pride, grateful just to be somewhere the guns had not yet reached. Daniel, Ruth, and Caleb organized them into crews woodcutting, cooking, watch shifts. The children helped where they could. Ruth gave up her writing hours to teach the youngest how to read. The sound of children's voices reciting letters echoed in the rafters for the first time in years. But even with warmth and food, fear hung in the trees. Every creak of branch, every cry of hawk, every gust of wind that slammed the shutters made them flinch. They knew it couldn't last forever. And it didn't. 3 days later, hoofbeats came again. But this time, they weren't strangers. The sound of hooves on hardened earth came like a tremor too steady to be wild mustangs, too sharp to be deer. Caleb was already up, leaning into the wind at the edge of the ridge with Daniel beside him. Ruth stood just behind, one hand instinctively reaching for the small knife at her hip, though she knew steel wouldn't be enough if what came riding wasn't looking for mercy. The riders came into view like ghosts, breaching the morning mist. 5 of them. Uniformed, but not matching. Weapons, but not raised. Their horses were dust-streaked and tired, like they'd ridden through more than just distance. Daniel tensed beside Caleb. "That's not regular cavalry." Caleb nodded. "No, that's something else." The man in front pulled his horse to a stop just at the edge of the clearing. He didn't dismount, didn't shout. He simply lifted a hand, palm open, a gesture not of peace, but of request. Ruth stepped forward before either Caleb or Daniel could stop her. The lead rider's eyes met hers. He was young, too young to wear such exhaustion. But there was clarity in him. No threat. No power games. Just the weight of someone sent to carry a message too big for his own shoulders. "I was told to find Ruth Hollow," he said. His voice was gravel and wind, and when he said her name, it didn't sound like a summons. It sounded like he'd come from far too many places, where her name had been whispered with a strange kind of hope. "I'm Ruth," she said. He nodded, then finally dismounted. His coat flared open, no badge, no flag, just leather worn thin by consequence. "I bring word from Elias." At that, Caleb's jaw tightened, but Ruth's hand gently brushed his wrist. Not to silence, just to say, "Wait." The rider continued. "He's not coming. Not yet." But he sent a warning. Daniel's shoulders shifted, almost imperceptibly. "A warning?" The rider nodded. 3 days from now, the Red Gate Battalion moves west. They've been burning non-sanctioned settlements under the resource order. The one that claims all water sources belong to the Union. Ruth asked. The man grimaced. "That's the one." Caleb's voice was a low growl. "So, this is about the spring. The spring that ran beneath their ridge, the one Ruth and Caleb had used quietly for years. Never diverted, never hoarded, but enough to survive. Enough to be wanted." The rider looked down. "Elias says they'll come whether you stand or run." Silence. "But he also said," the man continued slowly, "if you choose to stand, he'll make sure you're not alone." Ruth frowned. "Why?" The rider met her gaze again. "Because he says you're not just a healer. You're the last good thing left on this trail." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Ruth asked quietly, "And you? Why did you come?" He shrugged. "Because I used to be a boy someone saved once, and I never forgot what it felt like to drink clean water from a stranger's hand." That evening, the cabin buzzed, not with fear, but with preparation. The newcomers weren't helpless. Many had run before. Many had fought, and none wanted to run again. Caleb drew out an old map, laid it across the table. Daniel placed stones where blind spots might be. One of the older men, a miner, offered knowledge of tunnels beneath the ridge. The blacksmith began reforging broken tools into makeshift weapons. And Ruth walked from person to person. She didn't say we'll survive. She said, we'll be remembered for how we stand. At night, fires burned in 2 circles, one for warmth, one for watch. Children slept in the loft, unaware of the decisions being made beneath them. The adults shared food, stories, and for the first time, a collective vow: no one leaves. No one is left behind. By midnight, Caleb sat beside Ruth on the porch, moonlight painting his hands pale where they rested on his knees. "I don't want to fight," he said. "I know," she replied. "You just want to keep what's yours." He shook his head. "It's not mine anymore." Ruth looked at him. "It's ours," he said. She reached over and laced her fingers through his. Across the ridge, the wind shifted. The trees whispered of something old and unbroken. And far off, in the distance, a hawk called once loud and clear before the silence returned. Dawn didn't rise gently. It came like a blade through the horizon, slicing night from day with a clarity no one could ignore. The entire ridge was already stirring by the time the sun kissed the tops of the pines. Sleep had been a rumor, not a fact. Those who had closed their eyes the night before had done so in shifts, and with one hand always near a blade, a shovel or a rifle. Ruth moved like breath between them, waking the mothers softly, checking the fever of a boy who'd been coughing all night and handing off a flask of brewed mint to calm a grandfather's nerve. Her touch wasn't loud. It didn't ask for thanks. But people stepped aside for her, not out of reverence, but recognition, that she carried not just medicine, but something rarer, resolve without bitterness. Caleb was by the creek, shirt off, hauling timber. He didn't bark orders, he simply worked faster than any man there, and that was enough to get others moving. His back, lined with old scars and fresh sweat, was a map of choices made. And Ruth saw that too. They were building not a fortress, but a resistance. Not to wage war, but to remind whoever came that this land was not empty and its people were not expendable. By noon, Daniel had marked the ridge with strips of red cloth signals between lookouts. The old blacksmith, Elias's former friend, handed out blades refashioned from plow tips. No one smiled, but no one panicked either. It was the strange calm of people who knew what was coming and had chosen, anyway, to stay. That evening, just as the sky turned copper and the first long shadows stretched across the clearing, Ruth found Caleb seated on the steps of the root cellar. He was carving a piece of pine's slow, methodical strokes. "What is it?" she asked, kneeling beside him. He turned it in his hand. It was a small figure, rough but unmistakable. A woman standing with her back straight, hands open. "You," he said simply. She blinked. "You think I look that serious?" Caleb gave the faintest grin. "You look like you carry more than your share and never ask who's watching." She didn't respond right away, just watched his hands, the way he shaped wood, like someone who understood what it meant to chip away what didn't belong until something essential remained. Then she whispered, "I'm afraid, Caleb." He set the carving down. "So am I." She looked up at him. "That's why we'll do it right," he said. "Because we know what fear feels like. We won't let it speak for us." The moment hung there quiet, whole. Then the sound of hooves. Again. But different this time. One rider. No dust trail. A single horse, coming down the trail, slow, deliberate. Caleb stood. Ruth was already moving toward the gate. The rider stopped. It was Elias. Older than Ruth remembered. Thinner, but his eyes were sharp, and his posture had the kind of gravity that made even the wind go quiet. He dismounted without a word, walked forward, and placed something into Ruth's hands. A bundle wrapped in cloth. She opened it slowly, maps, old and newly marked. A list of names. A signal code. A worn photo of a spring hidden somewhere near the eastern slope. And a letter. Sealed. He didn't explain. Just said, the Red Gate commander is named Mercer. He doesn't bluff, but he does underestimate people who choose quiet over rage. Ruth nodded. He'll be here in 2 days, Elias added. Maybe less. Caleb spoke. And what do you bring besides a warning? Elias smiled without teeth. 3 riders behind me, 6 more by dusk. You're not alone anymore. That night, for the first time since the word eviction had hung over their heads, Ruth didn't dream of burning fields. She dreamed of roots growing deeper, of a cabin not just surviving, but lasting. And she dreamed of hands hers, Caleb's, Daniel's, even Elias's, reaching forward not to push back, but to hold the line. Because some places, once healed, don't get abandoned again. The morning after Elias arrived felt unlike any other. It wasn't the weather, it still carried that crisp, pine-scented edge that sliced into your lungs and made you feel awake, whether you liked it or not. It wasn't even the sounds birds still called, wood still creaked under boots, and children still squabbled quietly near the rain barrels. No, it was something underneath all of that, something unspoken but pulsing. A rhythm. A readiness. Ruth woke before the first light touched the ridge. She didn't need to wake Caleb. He was already gone from the cot beside hers, his side cold. She found him just beyond the clearing, crouched beside a ring of stones that had once been a fire pit, but now cradled a pot of dye, boiling over a slow flame. Strips of cloth soaked in it, then dried on lines strung between trees, deep red, bold as blood. Signal flags, he said before she could ask. One color. No confusion. She nodded. Her hands still smelled of cedar and salve from the night before. She could still feel the rough edge of Elias's maps, tucked safely in a chest beneath the sleeping pallets. Across the camp, Elias stood with Daniel, going over positions. Caleb had cleared the ridge's upper path 2 weeks ago, not for war, but for timber. That path now served as the fallback route. Ruth had memorized it in silence. Throughout the morning, more riders came. First 3, just as Elias said. Then 5 more before midday, faces Ruth didn't know but trusted instantly by the way they looked at the land, not at her. Most had no words. One had only one arm. Another was barely past 17, but her bow was carved from seasoned ash and her hands didn't shake. Caleb built without pause. Reinforced fences, dug short trenches near the creek where the water could be redirected. They didn't plan to meet fire with fire, but they'd hold the ground with every bone and breath, if it came to that. Ruth tended to everything else, checking stockpiles, calming mothers who'd packed and repacked their bundles 3 times, reminding the elders that they weren't burdens. She whispered to the frightened and sang to the children even when her voice cracked. At dusk, she climbed the watchtower Elias and Caleb had patched together that morning. From there, she could see the whole valley. It should have looked fragile. It didn't. She found Caleb waiting when she climbed back down, standing beneath the lean to where they sometimes shared meals, sometimes silence. There's still time to leave, he said quietly. You don't owe this place anything. She looked at him. That's where you're wrong. He frowned. She continued. I owe it everything, because it didn't spit me out when I had nothing. It let me stay. It let me heal. Caleb didn't argue, just sat beside her on the bench and handed her a tin cup of warm cider. Night fell slow. The stars blinked on, one by one, like the ridge was remembering itself in pieces. And just before Ruth stood to leave, Elias came into the circle. He hadn't said much all day, hadn't needed to. But now, as the fire flickered low, he said only one thing. "Mercer's scouts are 2 miles out. They'll arrive by morning." No one moved. Then Caleb said, "Then tomorrow, we speak with the land under our feet, and we don't lie." Ruth whispered into the dark, "Let them hear truth in our stillness." No one said amen. No one needed to. Because when silence is chosen, not forced, it speaks louder than any war cry. Morning came, gray and heavy, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Mist clung low to the fields, softening edges, muting sound, but no one in the ridge settlement was fooled by the calm. They knew what lay beyond it, hooves waiting, boots ready, orders scribbled on parchment carried by men who had never built a home with their own hands. Ruth stood at the gate with her sleeves rolled and her hair tied back. There was no trembling in her. She had already said everything that needed to be said with her presence. She had chosen this place, chosen these people, and most of all, chosen not to run. Beside her stood Caleb, broad and grounded as ever, his fingers curled loosely around the handle of a spade, not a gun. "You know," he said, voice low, "I've faced wolves more reasonable than some of these men." Ruth gave a tight smile. "Then it's a good thing you're more stubborn than a mountain." The mist parted slowly as the riders approached. Not fast. This wasn't an ambush. This was a message. The first two wore Redgate insignias, clean uniforms, swords strapped high. Behind them came a smaller wagon, its sides marked with the blood-red seal of official authority. Then Mercer. Commander Ezra Mercer didn't look like the devil Ruth imagined. He looked tired, dangerous in a practiced way. His eyes scanned the encampment, not with disgust, but calculation. This was a man used to solving problems by removing them. He rode to the gate and stopped, boots still in stirrups, hands unmoving. "Who's in charge here?" No one answered. Then Ruth stepped forward. Mercer raised a brow. "A woman." She didn't blink. "A healer, a farmer, a neighbor. We don't use the word in charge here. We use the word responsible." A flicker of something passed his face. Not amusement. Not quite irritation. Something more uncertain. "You're trespassing on government-cleared territory," he said. "You were given notice. This land is requisitioned for development under..." "Under what right?" Caleb asked, stepping beside Ruth now. Mercer turned to him. "Under the law." Elias, leaning on his cane behind the gate, spoke next. "And who makes the law when the people who live here were never given a say?" Mercer paused, for just a beat. Then he signaled to one of his aides, who reached into the wagon and pulled out a rolled scroll. "This lists the properties in question," Mercer said, opening it. "All of which are But Ruth stepped forward and placed something atop the scroll. A stack of handwritten petitions. Every name, every elder's mark, every child's scribbled drawing beside a parent's consent, every witness who had signed that these people had lived, worked, and bled on this land long before a Redgate seal touched it. Mercer didn't pick it up. "You think this matters?" he asked. "It mattered enough for every person here to risk writing it," Ruth said. "It matters more than your orders, because it holds truth. Not policy. Truth." Silence. Then Mercer leaned forward just slightly. "You know what's going to happen, don't you?" Ruth didn't flinch. "I do. You'll threaten us. You'll give us a deadline. And when that doesn't work, you'll come back with more men and hope we're too afraid to stand." Mercer didn't confirm. He didn't deny. Then he said, "You have until sundown tomorrow," and turned his horse. The Redgate men followed. No one in the camp spoke until the last hoofbeat vanished into the mist. Then Caleb said, "We have one night." Ruth looked around, at the faces no longer hiding, no longer wondering what would happen. They knew now. And still, they stayed. She turned to Caleb. "Then we use it, not to prepare for war." He nodded, "But to prepare for truth." And through the hours that followed, under the wide, uncertain sky, the people of the ridge did not dig trenches. They planted seeds, not for defense, but for memory. Because win or lose, they would not let this land forget who loved it most. They came at sundown, just like Mercer said, not with fire, not with war drums, but with wagons, soldiers, and silence. There was no need to shout when you had the law in your pocket and the power to rewrite what history remembered. But the ridge was ready, not in the way armies are, but in the way families are when grief comes to the door. Together, still, rooted. Ruth stood in the center of the field they had just planted the day before. It was bare, of course, no sprouts yet, only earth turned and dark from water and care. The rows were uneven. Hands had trembled. Children had helped. But the work was there, speaking plainly in the soil. We were here. Caleb stood beside her, shirt sleeves rolled, the same spade in his hand. But this time, it wasn't for digging. It was just there, like him. Solid, silent, ready. Mercer rode in slowly, at the head of 3 wagons and maybe 20 armed men. Enough to move people, not enough to start a battle. The message was clear. This was eviction, not war. Or at least, it was meant to look that way. The moment the wheels creaked into the ridge, Ruth stepped forward alone. Elias, Daniel, and a few elders stood behind her. The children were gathered beneath the eaves, held by mothers who tied red cloth around their arms. Mercer dismounted. Dust clung to his boots. His face was unreadable. "You had your time," he said. "And we used it," Ruth replied. "We didn't spend it on walls, or traps, or vengeance. We spent it showing this land what it meant to be loved." Mercer looked around, at the people, the soil, the worn benches and patched roofs, at Elias leaning on his cane beside a girl too young to know what politics meant, but old enough to feel when something sacred was about to be taken. "You think that stops what's coming?" he asked. Ruth shook her head. "No, but it will outlast it." Mercer narrowed his eyes. "You're refusing to leave. We're refusing to disappear." A murmur rippled through the soldiers behind him. Not outrage, uncertainty. One shifted on his feet. Another looked at the sky. And then, before Mercer could reply, something unexpected happened. From the woods behind the ridge, where the paths twisted into the pines, riders emerged. At first, just 1. Then 6. Then a dozen. Men and women from the outlying towns, from the Lakota villages, from the hills where old allies still remembered old promises. They came not with weapons raised, but with their presence. Quiet, watching. Enough to say, "We see this." Mercer turned. His jaw worked. "These people aren't armed," he said. Caleb stepped forward. "Neither are we." Mercer walked a few paces, glancing at the petition still folded in his satchel. At the field, the watchers, his own men, the war that wasn't going to start, the truth that refused to be ignored. And maybe it wasn't mercy. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or something else. But in the end, he said only one thing. "Fine. We'll file the dispute. It'll take months, maybe years." He paused. "Until then, this land is under review." It was a lie, of course. A way to save face. But it was also a window. A breath. And when he mounted his horse again, he didn't look back. The wagons turned. The soldiers followed. And when they were gone, truly gone, no one cheered. Instead, Ruth sank to her knees in the field and pressed her hands to the dirt. Not to weep, to give thanks. Caleb crouched beside her, and in a voice so soft only she heard it, he said, "You held them all together." She shook her head. "They held me." The stars came out slowly that night, and someone started humming an old song that didn't belong to any one place but felt like home to everyone. Children danced barefoot in the furrows. Elders sat without fear. And under the wide sky, Ruth leaned against Caleb's shoulder and finally let herself rest. Because sometimes the wildest fight isn't one of bullets or blood. It's the one where you stay, where you don't vanish, where you choose to be seen. And in that kind of fight, Ruth and the Ridge had already won.